So we are like 6 or 7 videos into this journey of what makes a good warp yarn. And up to this point, I haven't talked about fuzzy warp yarns. Why is that? Well, there are actually a couple of really good reasons why you might want your warp yarn to be smooth instead of textured or fuzzy. And we're going to talk about those reasons in this video. But if you're like me and you also like breaking the rules every now and then, we're also going to talk about what you can do if you find yourself wanting to use a textured or fuzzy warp yarn in your weaving. Hi. I'm Pamela from Fibersprite.com, and I help textile artists understand what they need to know so they can get down to their real passion, actually working with fiber. Usually, when we're talking about what makes a good warp yarn, texture doesn't come into play, or if it does, we're told to avoid it. There are actually several reasons. The first is the most obvious, and that is when a textured yarn passes through the reed and the heddles, it's more likely to catch on things. When it catches, it's going to stretch and stretch and stretch until it breaks. And broken warp ends are something that most people just don't want to deal with. Another really good reason behind the no textured yarn myth or rule is that when a slubby yarn is created, that slub typically has less twist than the rest of the yarn around it. That spot with less twist is a weak point and it's more likely to break at that point. To create texture across the yarn, there are going to be lots of these little points and lots of little opportunities for breakage. Another truth behind the no textured yarn myth or rule is that when many slubby yarns are created, they are in those slubby sections. Those underspun sections are more likely to drift apart and break. And a slubby yarn, by its very nature, has lots of those little sections and lots of opportunities for breakage across the yarn. This isn't much of a problem in knitting because it's not going to be under the tension and abrasion that happens when you're at the loom. Other textured yarns, like mohair, tend to have a reputation for being sticky. What does this mean? This means that there are lots of tiny little fibers that stick out from the yarn. The way that the yarn is constructed, it's made into a boucle and then it's brushed so that lots of hairs stick out into a halo and make it nice and soft and fuzzy. This structure of the yarn combined with the properties of the fibers themselves mean that they kind of want to stick together like Velcro, and it makes getting a clean shed difficult. With other novelty yarns like chenille or ribbon yarns, tension issues might come into play. With chenille in particular, the tension is really critical, and if it's not under a proper amount of tension, the yarn is going to want to worm its way out of the fabric and it'll ply back on itself in these little twists and pigtails that weavers generally just find unattractive and kind of frustrating to work with. So with all that said, should you avoid textured yarns in your warp and just use them in your weft? Really, that's up to you, but there are some really interesting things that can happen with textured warps that are going to create a unique fabric if you're willing to try it. First, you'll still need to make sure that your yarn is strong enough to be a warp yarn. I have a whole video on this topic and it's linked up here somewhere as well as in the description below. You'll also want to choose a structure of weaving that shows off your textured yarn instead of obscures it. I find that going simple is a great idea. I really love plain weave plus textured yarns. I've also had nice success with having a high contrast in color and color value between the textured yarn of the warp and a smooth yarn in the weft. One additional consideration is if you're using a very highly textured or slubby yarn, you want to have at least one ply of that yarn be something strong and smooth. This will help give it strength. 2 plies of something strong and smooth is even better. Basically what that does is it allows those strong, smooth plies to act as the strength of the warp, and then the texture can play in separately. You'll also need to make sure that your yarn is thin enough at its thickest point to pass through both your heddles and your reed easily. If it doesn't do this, you're going to have problems the whole time you're weaving. Now, if you do have a yarn that's too thick, this doesn't mean you can't weave with it at all. You can still use it as weft, but you could even still use it as warp if you make some accommodations and alterations to your loom. You could make string heddles that are big enough to accommodate your thicker yarns. And you could also weave without a reed. This is a technique that's often employed by saori weavers and people who are weaving with art yarns. A more open set often helps with textured and fuzzy yarns. Except for chenille, which needs to be set very tightly to prevent the worming that we described earlier, most textured and fuzzy yarns will benefit from a more open set. This helps keep them catching on their neighbors. Patience and keen observation are key when you're working with textured and slubby yarns. If something seems a little bit off, take a minute and check to make sure that there's nothing catching or about to break. If something does break, remember it's not the end of the world. It's easy to do a repair warp. I have a quick video that shows you how to do that. Be sure to keep a keen eye on your cloth as you're making it. If there are any warp ends that aren't being woven in, it might be a tension issue. It could also be a threading issue, but if it's a tension issue, you could just add a weight to give it some extra tension and make sure that it weaves in. You might end up with the odd broken warp end, but that's not a big deal. Repairing broken warp ends is just a part of the process, and it's an important skill to master. What you do want to be concerned with is if you're having broken warp end after broken warp end after broken, and that just indicates that there's something wrong either with your yarn, it's not strong enough, or your tension, or some other factors coming into play that's causing those breakages. And if it can be addressed, you want to address it. Is weaving with textured warps worth it? I think so. You can get some really interesting techniques, and I've woven a whole jacket with all textured yarns in the warp. And I really enjoyed both the process and the final results. But don't just take my word for it. Try it out and let me know how it goes in the comments. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.